The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here as always with my co-host, John Cuna. And John, today, before we get into the featured athlete and the featured mental health topic, I just want to get some feedback from you on what do you think so far after 6 episodes of the Grim Drive podcast.
Certainly been a blast. Honestly, that's been the first thing I was thinking of when I was trying to just look back at what we've done so far. It's been so much fun, more than I was expecting. To be able to get into some of these topics through the lens of athletics, just because I think that the tide is totally turned and people are now more open and talking about some of this stuff. And so to have like another platform to be able to do this has been really great. I think the reception that we've gotten from you guys, so thanks everyone for tuning in and giving us some feedback, has been really positive and been talking like this is such a gap and this is such a creative way to talk about these things. So sort of just good confirmation that we're on the right track. And it's been really nice to be able to talk about these things not in a room with a singular person. I think that's been a kind of a nice thing, to be able to like share some of our experiences and some of our things that we've been able to like what we do, and with a greater population of people, hopefully, obviously, to try to reach as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. And I think that having more of these has been great. I think the first few, thanks for everyone staying patient with us. The first few were like, we're trying to catch our rhythm. And I feel like the last couple of episodes have been really great. And we felt a little bit more like just comfortable with this. And I'm really excited to dive into the episode for today on Robin Lehner and talking a little bit about a whole host of different things. But it's just, I think for me, it's been really great to just have a place, talk about these things, and sort of shoot some ideas around. So, I think my biggest takeaway has just been, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. It's been a lot more fun than I expected. I expected it to be enjoyable and a good experience and a learning experience for sure. But it's definitely been more fun than I expected. I think you make some good points about having this as a forum to talk about these things. We've worked with individual clients for a very long time. We have a lot of experience with that. But we knew at some point it was probably important for us to try to reach a larger audience with this helpful information. We're not trying to make money. We're not going for notoriety here. No. That's like the last thing I want. It's not my cup of tea. But I do want to help people. We both want that a lot. And this is a good way to do it. We're hoping that a lot of people, find this information, get access to this podcast or watch it on YouTube, and are able to gain something, even if they just gain one helpful thing per episode. I think that's a huge win in my book. Yeah. Because a lot more people can access it than just doing one-on-one, outpatient therapy or coaching like we do on a regular basis. So I agree with you on that. I think one of my takeaways is just how much information is out there already about this stuff. Like how many athletes are talking about it? How many other people on social media are trying to create things, whether it's on Instagram or mostly on Instagram, some on Facebook, but trying to create hashtags or followings that really just shine a light on mental health and in particular male mental health. I think is something we're passionate about. Finding more of those I think has been amazing because I didn't know that many existed, and also we're trying to formulate connections between some of these groups and some of these missions so that we can join forces or try to collaborate, and I think joining forces makes those things more likely to happen, which is what we're after. So that's been really cool to see. I think that the link between athletes that we focus on each episode has kind of been interesting. I feel like there's always some sort of link between one episode and one athlete we focused on and then another one. I also think there's been more links between athletes in general in these leagues that I didn't expect to see when we do this research. We see so-and-so talk to so-and-so about this, or so-and-so talk to another athlete and got feedback. And that's really awesome to see as well. The depth of the stories has been great. Finding, when doing research for these episodes, just seeing the level of depth of what these people have gone through, what these athletes have gone through, and how they talk about it, and how their teammates and coaches and teams have been involved to some degree has been great to see as well. I think another takeaway for me has been, the absence of the impact of the absence of sports on the collective mental health. And I wouldn't compare it to like, the more serious aspects of COVID or what's going on in terms of physical health, like, people who have COVID or people have lost loved ones due to COVID. It's obviously not compared to that. But I think we know how important distraction is as a coping mechanism. I think we talk about how it's too often used, but it is still an important distraction, important method of coping, distracting ourselves in different healthy ways. And sports is one of the main ways we do that. So I think that's to have that taken away for different periods or to have it change and not hear actual fans in the stands and different little elements like that. I've been surprised at how much that's affected me, and I think it's affected a lot of other people. And I think rooting for a team unites people. Sometimes it divides people in a sports way, but I think mostly it unites people. Brings people together to join for a common cause, same kind of thing that they're going for. And I think that's always a good thing. So that's one thing that stood out to me is that I think that's been missed.
Yeah.
And I think when things start to continue to get back to normal, that's one of the biggest things I'm looking forward to is hearing people in the stands and just having sports be back where they need to be.
Yeah, I agree. And you made one really great point about when we're doing a lot of these, researching these athletes and the things that they've been going through and learning about their stories and, like you said, hearing more about like so-and-so talking to so-and-so and getting support and things like that. I think that's been such a great point because it's happening more and more even now. And I think before, even 10 years ago, these athletes wouldn't have as many opportunities of like, oh, who can I talk to about these different things or who else might be going through this stuff? It was just, you felt siloed. And we're going to get into that about Robin Lehner and some of the stuff that he went through. But now there are ample examples of people coming out and talking about what the pieces are. And for these professional athletes, it's comforting to be able to go to another professional athlete who can highly relate to what their scenario is as being sort of someone in the spotlight, having lots of pressure on them as an athlete, and being able to talk openly about this type of stuff. So that's a great point, I think, and it's something we're hoping to see more of. And quite frankly, in the last 6 months, maybe it's just because I've been doing more research in this at all, but there've just been name after name after name after name of athletes coming out talking about their own mental health and their struggles and how they're getting support, and it's wonderful to see.
Yeah, and we've seen how change often starts with one person who's willing to take a massive chance or a couple people.
Yeah, and
you've definitely seen that happen across the board in different sports, and I think you're seeing the domino effect of that happen, and that's so important because now obviously I think the most important thing is that these people have access to care and that they're more likely to have a healthy lifestyle, which is the most important thing. But even after that, I think it makes them better athletes. I think it makes them better teammates. I think it makes the product on the field or the court or the ice better to watch as a fan. I think it endears the athletes to the fans even more. It makes more of an emotional connection.
Big time.
Which ultimately, I think there's no loss from that, right? And I think we're starting to see when athletes speak out, we'll get into this, more in the next episode, but even when people in the media sort of come after them for being weak or for coming out, you see like the wagon circle. And I don't think that would have happened a long time ago. And that's to me a great sign because you can tell that now if you're someone that tells you got to hold it all in, you got to be stoic, you can't show weakness, you're going to get attacked by the people who are like, that's ridiculous. And we're past that. So
they're the exception, not the rule anymore.
Absolutely.
It's great to see.
That was not the case for a very long time, maybe even 5 years ago. So, so we are going to focus on Robin Lehner and PTSD today. I think there's a kind of a connection between this episode and our last episode where we did Josh Gordon. Josh Gordon, I didn't see anything about him being diagnosed with PTSD, but we know he had trauma in his childhood, and we know that trauma is very complicated and it often leads to substance use. And so we could have flipped these episodes, really. I mean, when we look at Josh Gordon, we focused more on the substance abuse side of things. With Robin Lehner, I think substance abuse was at the core of what sort of led to him getting help, but PTSD is really what the main issue is, I think. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Did you know anything about Robin Lehner before we did this?
No, same thing. I mean, sort of similar to what most of it is. I've done some digging, and he had some pretty outstanding games against the Bruins. So really, the only context I have is him as just a good competitor against the Bees. But I knew he bounced around from a bunch of different places. We'll speak about the reputation, but he had a reputation of being like hot and cold. without any context of what was going on. I know that one of my takeaways, which I'll go into in a minute, was about that. But, I knew one of the things I knew from beforehand was that he didn't start playing hockey until kind of late, and I mean late, he was like 10 or 11 years old or something like that. With you hear most professional athletes, you're like, they started skating at like 2 years old or 3 years old. Yeah. So that kind of stood out to me as one thing that was different. But
yeah, I didn't know much about him. I remember when we started prepping to figure out which athletes we wanted to cover with the podcast in general, I think you brought him up, and I didn't even know about that story. And then shortly after that, I think one of my friends who I told told about the podcast I was upcoming mentioned to look at this guy and look at his story. I think his main article was maybe in The Athletic, which we've read as prep for this. But I read that. I had no idea. I really didn't know who he was up until this point. So really fascinating to learn about his story and how complicated it is. So we'll do a quick bio on Robin Lehner. He's a Swedish professional hockey goalie. He currently plays for the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL. He has also played previously with the Ottawa Senators, Buffalo Sabres, New York Islanders, and Chicago Blackhawks. He was selected in the second round of the 2009 NHL draft by the Senators. In 2019, he won the NHL's William M. Jennings Trophy for fewest goals allowed and the Bill Masterton Memorial Trophy for perseverance, sportsmanship, and dedication to the sport of hockey, while also being named as a finalist for the Vezina Trophy, which is the league's most outstanding goaltender. A couple of random facts about Robin Lehner. Like you said, John, he didn't start playing hockey till he was 10. I think he played soccer before.
Yep.
That's very late in the game for someone who becomes a pro athlete to start their sport, their focus sport. At age 19, he became the youngest Swedish hockey goaltender to play in the NHL, which is pretty amazing, even especially with that 10-year-old thing. 9 years, he goes from never playing the sport to the youngest goalie from his country to ever play in the NHL. He's a fan of melodic death metal, and in particular, a Swedish band called In Flames, which originated from his hometown of Gothenburg, and the band even influenced the design on his mask. I had a buddy in college who was really into metal. He was a big Pantera fan, and anything produced by Rick Rubin. You a Pantera fan at all?
No, not so much.
No. Yeah, not me either. I tried to get into it, but just didn't take. So we talked about how the band In Flames influenced the design of his mask. He also has a hashtag Same Here on his mask, which is ties into his charitable organization that I think he's affiliated with and helps out with. Same Here is a nonprofit founded by a 15-year pro sports executive named, I think it's Eric Kusin or Kusin. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, so I apologize to him for that. The goal of Same Here is to change the global conversation through mental health advocacy and ultimately just continue to reduce the stigma. I think that pro sports executive, Eric, also struggled with past trauma and PTSD and went through his own experience, and it motivated him to really dedicate his life moving forward to this cause. And so it's really cool to see Robin Lehner attached with that. So we put the link to that organization, that nonprofit organization, in the show notes as well, in case people want to take a look, want to donate. They're also on Instagram. They're on every social media platform. They really got some cool things going. I reached out to them to see if we can help in any way. So that's a few random facts about Robin Lehner and his bio. We're going to get into the player spotlight now a little bit in terms of our takeaways. And I just want to go through a little bit to start before I kick it to you, John, in terms of, we're starting with diagnosis with Robin Lehner. I think it's a complicated situation. Probably one of the more complicated ones we've covered so far. Usually mental health is more complicated than just one thing, right? But oftentimes people might have one diagnosis and other things kind of going on. He has a lot of different things. And so his diagnosis is, as he describes it, is bipolar. I think he said bipolar 1, as well as ADHD and PTSD with trauma and suicidal ideation. So I'm going to get into this. A lot of jargon I just threw. Probably got flagged for that. But bipolar, I think probably used to be called manic depression. But bipolar is basically where people sort of go, they fluctuate from two ends of the spectrum, right? They're either, really, really down and depressed, or they cycle to what's called periods of mania or hypomania. And basically what that means is you're kind of like totally keyed up, tons of energy, think you can take on the world, delusions of grandeur. Invincible, right? Invincibility. And I think bipolar gets, people, sort of in, non-clinicians tend to overthink bipolar. Like if someone's angry and then they're sad, it's like they're bipolar. That is not what it is. If you've ever seen a person who actually has bipolar, it's kind of scary. It really is much, much different than people think. When someone's in a manic state, it's mania. They are really, you would spot it right away. It's very, very noticeable. It's not just someone who's a little bit pissed off. It's very different than that. So he has bipolar, and ADHD and PTSD. And those, we also said, at points he's had suicidal ideation, which essentially means, a person is having either active or passive thoughts about harming themselves, about taking their own life. So when he is at that point, obviously things have really gotten to a bad point. And he even says, his bipolar came from his PTSD. It came from the trauma that he went through when he was a kid. He didn't really get into much detail, and we're probably not going to get into detail around trauma anyway in terms of someone's specific trauma experience. But clearly, it was a childhood of abuse. He said abuse, addiction, and mental illness. Yeah. Sounds a little bit like what Josh Gordon maybe went through, like, neglect and just a childhood around that kind of stuff. And so the substance abuse came later. He mentioned that kind of started more in 2015 after a concussion, I think, is when it got worse. Yep. He was drinking, a case of beer a day to cope. And the path to getting help for him started with a panic attack mid-game in 2018, like Kevin Love. So we see how these episodes and these topics kind of weave together a little bit. It was curious that they sent him home after that. The panic. I was kind of confused.
That stood out to me too.
Yeah, we don't know enough about that, but
and they had like a medical doctor to say that was they wanted to get him out. And I was curious about that.
That stood out to me because I don't think I would have recommended that personally. I think, when someone goes through a panic attack, you need to probe a little bit more to figure out what's going on, make sure they're safe. Yeah. And clearly in this scenario, they didn't know that he was suicidal. Sure. And that is not someone you want to send home when that's happening.
By themselves.
You need to really screen them and find out what's going on. We don't know enough about what really happened there, but so shortly after I think he went home and he told his wife right away. Thankfully, that he had that kind of moment of clarity where he said, I need to get help. She was obviously very supportive. He went to detox and rehab shortly after that incident. And I guess his detox was pretty bad. He went through like a 3-week detox period where one of the worst they had seen apparently. And they didn't use this term, but it sounded like he had what's called delirium tremens, which is where when you're an alcoholic, we talked about this in the Josh Gordon episode with weed, but with weed and alcohol, especially like, alcoholics who drink during all day for every day for many days in a row, you're shutting off different cells in the brain that are responsible for cleaning out your brain while you sleep to regenerate and make you well rested. Right. And if you're drinking every day, you're robbing your brain of that day after day after day. And eventually it has a ripple effect, sort of boomerang effect, where when you get sober, your brain is essentially trying to catch up with the lost sleep it's had for a long time. And you end up having essentially dreams while you're awake. And it's called delirium tremens. It's a very scary thing. And alcohol recovery, believe it or not, it's important for people listening to know that I think it's the only drug that when you're getting sober from it, you can actually die if you don't have a structured treatment approach.
A trained detox.
Yeah. Whereas with other drugs, you might feel like death, but you're at risk of dying. Right. Alcohol really is, you're at risk. So that was just a huge takeaway for me that diagnosis is very complicated,
Yeah, that was honestly, that was one of my takeaways as well, was that a lot of times, and even in the way that we set up our podcast, it's sort of like athlete and one thing. And I think that's not always the case. I'd say majority of the time, there's multitude of things that are going on for different people. And his complex diagnosis was something that really stood out to me, and it's hard, especially with trauma. And there's been the last decade has been sort of like explosive in the world of trauma. There's been lots more research and pieces like that, and there's been a lot of comorbidities, which are sort of like dual diagnosis or other things that might be going on. And a lot of the diagnosed, like ADHD, a lot of people were diagnosed with ADHD, but it was actually trauma or, vice versa. So that was really something that stood out to me, in terms of his treatment with this. One of the things you brought up, to be going through all of these different things. And he speaks about that like moment of clarity where he like talked to his wife. I saw like an enormous amount of strength for him, not only to have that moment, but then when he was in detox, when his time was up to go home, he actually said, I want to stay longer, to continue to get more help, which I thought was just, I think it's easy to, this sort of speaks to my biggest takeaway, but it sort of speaks to, you have to sort of overcome the demonization of behavior for people. And I think a lot of people attack the behavior. And I think for him to be able to overcome some of that stuff and then be able to say, like, I need help, get help, and then I need to continue getting help, I thought was just a really big sign of strength. And I think that's part of the reason why he's been able to continue to do work. And he's been a huge outspoken advocate. But the complex diagnosis thing, I think, is hard. I think when you're working with someone individually, you have to get into sort of like triage mode almost of like, where are we treating and what's the most important thing to be treating. So that was definitely the thing that, one of the things that like really stood out to me when he was like going through his laundry list of things that he was dealing with. I couldn't help but have just like empathy and sort of like sadness for him of having all of those things that were going on and clearly going on for a long period of time. And he had to just sit with that for a while until he finally reached a breaking point and then luckily reached out rather than acted on some of his suicidal ideation, which was great. I think the trauma piece, which again, like you said, we're never going to sort of like blast people out there. He doesn't really speak too much about specifics of what had happened, but I think I think that especially him being sort of outspoken about trauma was really helpful because I think it happens more often for people, and for have another like talking head and figurehead for someone to talk about this was just really important. And you saw after he came out and talked about this, again, another sort of like wave of people coming out and talking about their own trauma and their own experience. So just another advocate for this. Absolutely. Was really great.
Yeah. No, you talk about triage. I think that is a really important concept in terms of like having an order of operations to how you attack the mental health issues that are going on, because you have to be selective about which one you start with, and there are priorities. If he's suicidal,
right,
and he is an alcoholic to the level where he really does need detox, those things have to come first.
Right.
You have to make sure a person's safe, so they're not going to harm themselves. That would require an inpatient stay of some kind. If they're also an alcoholic to that level, they need an inpatient detox. So it's got to be a detox facility where they can get clean. If you're not getting clean and you're still at risk of harming yourself, there's no point in working on the other things. You got to get that stuff kind of situated first. And that's clearly what they did. After that, then you obviously, I think as part of that, once they get him sober, it sounded like they made the bipolar diagnosis. So at that point, they're going to get him with bipolar treatment. There really is no, outpatient behavioral treatment that's going to treat the manic side of that. That's medication. They need medication. So so his team at that point is going to get him on some kind of probably an antipsychotic, I would guess. I don't know, but that would handle the manic side so that those manic episodes would probably stop happening or be far more likely to stop happening. And then they're going to, that gets him at least stable. So he's sober now. He's not suicidal.
Yeah.
The manic side of bipolar is stable. And that, I would guess, he says he felt like someone who was broken and needed to be put back together. Because what happens is once you take care of those things, which is obviously the biggest key.
Yeah.
Now he's very vulnerable.
Right.
But those have been the things that have been, and this is why bipolar, I think, can be caused by trauma, right? It's like the brain's way of almost fracturing and kind of surviving, right? So as is substance use, right? It's about numbing. So once you remove all the biggest threats, he's now very vulnerable. He's safer, but he's very vulnerable.
Right.
And which is why it's a key that he's in a treatment program like that.
Right.
Because they have to kind of unpack that stuff and help put him back together with his help. And I think that's where you start to get into the trauma, the past trauma, learning how to work through that, understand it better, and recover from that. And then ADHD probably comes far after that.
Yeah, definitely.
Probably is not even in the same conversation as this kind of
that's
stuff.
just that ADHD for him is probably more just education. But like you said, if you can't get to a stable, safe place, you can't address the PTSD and the trauma. It's going to be too reactive. You're going to get right back into the same cycles and same patterns and kind of go through that. You have to get to a place where you are even able to accept the information or the truth that you've been numbing yourself from trying to admit through substances or through whatever. If you can't get that sort of squared away first, treatment's really not going to work.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that kind of relates to this is the trajectory of mental health issues, or like the timeline, the cumulative timeline and the kind of ticking time bomb effect of mental health issues. I think a lot of times what might seem like a sudden mental health crisis, usually there's signs much earlier. And he even says something. I think he said, he suffered a panic attack between periods of a game on March 29th, 2018. But then he says, quote, "I think looking back, it definitely was too much too soon." And he said there's a lot of things I can pinpoint that I could have gotten help earlier because there were signs there all along, right? So I think we see that a lot where it might seem like it came out of nowhere, but usually there's at least months, probably years of red flags and signs that a person really needs some help, which is why it's so key for family members and friends to learn about this stuff too, because all it takes is one person to recognize some of those things to really intervene. Although it did sound like his wife was trying to get him help for a very long time, and he admits that he refused, and that's a huge problem too.
Right. I think ultimately too, it's you can have everybody around you saying you need help, but it has to come from that person to sort of come to that realization moment where they're like, I need to go and get some help. But I think that it speaks to the bubble that guys keep themselves in.
Totally.
Right? This fear of being vulnerable, right? We have
that
it completely back. It's brutal. We have it completely backwards. It's, vulnerability is weakness and silence is strength. And it's literally the exact opposite. It is far more difficult to be vulnerable and to admit what is going on for you than it is to just stay silent. Because he's a perfect example. Another example of someone who stayed silent about what they were going through, and it led to substance abuse, detox, things spiraling out of control. And the moment he opens up, is vulnerable, seeks help, he's on a better path now and is able to function better. I mean, I don't know how many examples we need to keep doing it for. Hopefully we're seeing more of this, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is to give more and more examples for people in the hopes that there's one of you guys listening out there that's like, wow, maybe I do that, and they are able to notice those red flags a little bit sooner before they pick up that bottle or they pick up those drugs or whatever, and say wow, maybe this is something that's going on for me too, and I can maybe I should be seeking some help as well. So that's just another hope. Just a great point you made. No,
totally. I mean, I agree with you. I think the more guys like him and people and athletes in general, male, female, and in between that we cover, the more they talk out about this stuff and they show that vulnerability and they show that not only is this possible, but it's better and it's helpful.
Yeah.
The more I think people are going to see these experiences and say, all right, I don't have to follow that old men's playbook. Right. That is outdated and clearly not helpful.
No.
So I think you're right on that sense. So, and that kind of brings me to one point I wanted to ask you a question about. I mean, I think that the main takeaway on this point is mental versus physical illness. And he says, I'm not ashamed to say I'm mentally ill, but that doesn't mean I'm mentally weak. Yeah. And I think that was a great quote. I think that's a great way to put it. And my question to you, John, which I've been pondering since I think yesterday I texted you that this was as I was doing research for this episode, it was kind of stuck in my head for a little while. The question is how did the whole thing start where mental illness was viewed as weakness, whereas physical health was never really viewed that way, or was it? It's just very confusing to me to look back and figure out what were the seeds of that? What caused it? What do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it comes from a lack of confidence and ego. Primarily, I think it's to admit that you're I think honestly too, I think one of the biggest takeaways is, or one of the biggest points I think, is that for physical treatment there's a path. Right? There was a very clear path. If you sprained your ankle or broke your ankle, there's a treatment path kind of moving forward. And for mental illness, there wasn't. And you're not supposed to talk about it. Right. And I think that sort of put that just umbrella of discomfort around it. Mm-hmm. And we don't talk about this. And it's, you're weak if you have this. And I think that sort of bled into everything. And then no one was able to talk about it. And then you see, and we'll get into this in the next podcast talking about Dak Prescott, but you would see people almost like whack-a-mole. You'd see someone come up and say something about mental illness, and then they'd be like, no, you're weak, and you'd be hit down. And of course, those were the examples that people were seeing as what would happen if I did talk about that. Mm-hmm. But if someone was saying, I tore my hamstring, like, okay, great, here's what you're going to do. Yeah. Right? Here's some support around that. Here's what we're going to do to take care of you. And if I've got PTSD, or I've got trauma, or I've got this, it was we don't want to deal with that, and you shouldn't be talking about that. And I think that over just decades and decades of repetition is what led to be where we are now.
Yeah, so you're kind of touching on two things. I think it sounds like it's the stigma that has been reducing, but was big for a large time. And then it's the lack of understanding, right? Yeah. So people, a lack of knowledge often leads to fear or judgment. People fear what they don't understand, right? So that's part of it. We didn't understand mental health or emotions for a very long time, which clearly led to collective judgment or avoidance. I think that's a big one, right? Mm-hmm. And then the stigma, it's interesting. I don't more, in terms of a more modern, more recent reason that stigma formed or was strengthened, I would guess is sort of the the changing landscape of the family. I think as things families have become less paternal, more of a balanced family, right? Less kind of driven by some stoic male head of house, typically, in terms of how it used to be viewed. I think that's one thing that's helped, because I think for a long time, that probably didn't help the stigma that was kind of forming in terms of guys, a man having to be the sole breadwinner and having to be the head of household and be strong and all that that didn't help. I think if you go back even farther, I would say for a long time, we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, I think being dominant and not showing weakness was a major factor or threat to one's place in society or survival for a very long time. So I would guess, if you try to figure out where it originated from, I'm guessing that's probably where. Yeah. And then, more modern times, it's the lack of understanding about mental health that's just prevented it from switching quicker, I think. Right. But it's an interesting question. It's something we're going to explore more. Maybe we'll cover it in a different episode, or we'll just, because I'm fascinated by it. I think it's important to continue to reduce the stigma. It's important to recognize where it came from. Yeah. I think that will help people, educate people to, okay, let's try to figure out how we got here in the first place, so that we can try to undo this a little bit and do it a different way. Yeah, not repeat the same mistakes that got us here. Exactly. So a couple other takeaways I had, one was the sort of real life over sports and the ramifications of him getting help. I think on the business side, I think it was maybe him or his agent. No, I think Robin Lehner actually says that, quote, "It hasn't been a smooth ride." No, I think it's his lawyer maybe said it, but it hasn't been a smooth ride, and Lehner's openness has come with major repercussions professionally. That was according to his agent. So I have a question on that. So for you, John, if we're really looking to reduce the stigma, right, to get the stigma gone, to have physical and mental health viewed the same, is it fair to allow teams to view mental illness as a possible reason to stay away from a player in the same way they would stay away from a player who's physical, has a physical exam and shows chronic knee issues? What do you think? Yeah, this is one that I struggle with, because certainly teams do steer away from people with physical history of physical injuries, or they've torn their hamstring, or they've got knee surgery or stuff like that, and that might give a second guess to that. However, the approach to that athlete around the physical side is, here are the things that we can do to support you while you're here to make sure that you're healthy and able to perform. And that same level of thought and processes is not, to my understanding, is not for the mental side, or the mental illness side. So the awareness of it. And so I think it's twofold. I think one, it's that they might not know. Athletes are sort of conditioned to not talk about that type of stuff, because for a long time, like I talked about, the demonization of it has been they've not had the freedom to talk about those things. I don't think it's fair, because for a lot of the things that people are going through, treatment is very simple if you are able to access it, and teams should be able to provide that. I argue that if you're able to treat that mental side for that athlete, they'll actually, if the treatment is done appropriately, they'll actually be a better athlete for the team if they're able to receive that level of support. There's extenuating circumstances, I'm sure, for everything. There's always going to be outliers for everything, but I don't think it's fair. And this kind of speaks to a broader sense too. I think that with more understanding and more conversation around mental health, one of my fears is that we're going to start to turn to sort of weaponizing mental health. And it's something that I worry about, of saying it's sort of a way for a team or anyone to sort of discount someone because they have mental illness. And I think that starts to swing the pendulum back towards the other direction, where we're trying to come away from. And so I that's one thing that I worry about, is just saying they've got PTSD, so we don't want them, and goodbye. And I think that it gives the wrong message to the person. It sort of probably validates fears for that athlete already of I'm different, I'm broken, I'm bad. And then to have a team say, we don't want you because of that, rather than how might we be able to support you while you're here on this team. I think it's just a different way of thinking about it. So I don't necessarily think it's fair. I think it just needs to be a part of the conversation as you're evaluating someone, just like you would if they're coming off of a back surgery or a knee surgery, to have that same level of conversation. That was sort of my biggest one. I'm still sort of going through how I feel about it, but I think that
there's no room for conversation around it yet, and it's not talked about the same as like I said about coming off of a surgery for an ankle or a knee. It's not talked about in the same way as just like this is something that they're going with, and here's how we can support them or not. It's like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that, and let's just leave it alone and not even talk about it. That's what I think I have the most problem with.
Yeah, you make some good points. I think this is definitely an interesting issue, and it requires a lot more thought because it's kind of evolving and it's hard to fully understand. I think with some difficult issues, that the tendency is to want to create sort of an all or nothing, black or white sort of solution, and it's rarely like that. I think these things require nuance and sometimes are case by case kind of specific in terms of how you approach it. I think you bring up some good points because I think on the physical medical side, they probably have teams of people for each professional sports team. They have a team of doctors and medical professionals who are informed about every possible diagnosis, so they know when a physical issue is something that can be rehabbed versus when it can't.
Right.
I don't think they have that level of care on the mental health side, so they're not probably aware enough yet. I think they're getting there, but not aware enough yet of what mental health issues mean what and how that could impact his standing as a player. Because I think a lot of times compared to physical issues, I think mental health issues have a greater chance to be improved. I would say that when it comes to you can't really compare them to chronic knee issues, because I think the mental health issues probably have a better chance of being rehabbed, of being changed, and maybe even making them a better player than they were before.
Exactly right.
So that is a key factor, I think, that maybe differentiates them a little bit. I also think it's a fine line. I'm hesitant to say that it's like we can never say that a person's mental health is a disclusionary criteria. I don't think it should be most of the time, but I'm hesitant to say. I think it's really risky to say that we just can never use that. I think there's examples of where you have to, because a person just can't, because of what they're struggling with mentally. There was one basketball player who I think he had such vicious anxiety and panic attacks, he couldn't travel. He couldn't travel on planes. I think maybe it was a fear of flying. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think he was a basketball player coming out of college. I want to say his name was Royce something. I can't remember. Maybe we'll look into that more. Yeah. But he couldn't get on planes. And he was drafted in the NBA, I believe, but could not play. And I think he plays in Canada now, maybe because travel's easier. Again, I'm speculating. I don't know a lot of the details, but that's an example of where it's not his fault, but also he can't, if he can't do it, then we're not going to put him in a position where he can't do something like that. Yeah. And I think there is a very fine line between, to acknowledge that mental health, I think it's important to acknowledge mental health illness is real while not using it as an excuse. That's what I always try to work on with clients is like, I think the example I would give, like if you look at ADHD, right? If someone says, I can't do my homework because I have ADHD, that's using it as an excuse. And I would never allow a client to say that, right? So do I, right? Whereas if you say ADHD makes it hard to focus, but I adjust to that by doing X, Y, Z. Yep. That is not that's acknowledging that it is an impact, but you're not using it as an excuse. And I think we have to be very careful collectively to just anytime someone says I'm taking a mental health day or I'm doing that, like, yes, it's good for people to take mental health days, but we have to know more about that kind of thing. We have to know the details. Are you understanding and addressing the mental health issue, or are you just throwing that out there as an excuse for something? Because there's a very fine line. I could see it going down that road where that could happen, and most importantly, I don't think that helps the conversation. No. That's my main focus. I think that's going to diminish the reality of mental health, which will lift the stigma back up. Right. I don't want that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what I was sort of saying. Like, I worry about it. Like, we have such a bad habit of just staying in one end of the spectrum or the other. And like, we're really trying to push towards like acceptance and understanding. And, this is something that's affecting a lot of people. And I worry that, it can almost go too far that direction and then just swing back to like, well, we're not going to talk about it anymore. Because it's too difficult. There is a way to be, good about this and stay in the middle. And like you said, it's something that's real, but it's not an excuse, right?
Absolutely.
You wouldn't draft a basketball player who is, a paraplegic or stuck in a wheelchair, right? That's just a reality, right? And so like the same type of stuff. There are certainly, that's what I was saying before, like there are going to be outliers just like everything. It's not an all or nothing thing. It has to, but my main point was that it has to be a part of the conversation.
Totally.
And a lot of the things that people are struggling with are highly treatable. And to both of our points about you can actually make a player better if they are able to get the treatment that they need for whatever might be hindering their abilities.
Yes, totally.
And I think that is not a conversation that goes into it. I think that, we talked about reputation with Brad Marchand. I feel like reputation is how most sports teams manage people's mental health. And I think that is a dangerous precedent because reputation is often the behavior, but it's not, what are they actually trying to communicate? It's not the root. Yep. And I think that's one of the biggest, that's a big issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think being informed, having information is key every single time, right? We can't just, be on one of the spectrum without being informed as to what are the details of really what's going on.
Right.
Because I think that it's always key. And I think, we're talking about from a collective standpoint, it's key to be careful that mental health is used as an excuse, because there's a fine line, but there is a difference, right?
Yeah.
Individually, it's problematic if that happens, because just like that ADHD example, if a client I'm working with uses ADHD as an excuse and says, I can't do my homework because I have ADHD, my main concern with that is that attitude is going to keep that person stuck.
Yeah.
And it's not going to help them get better. It's the only reason I care, right? If it helped them get better, fine, but it doesn't. It keeps them stuck,
right?
Which is not, we want forward momentum, right?
And that mentality is probably pervasive, not just with their homework. Right.
Correct.
Like it's all over the place.
Correct.
Like, I can't do this because of that.
Yes.
Like that way of thinking is just, it's coming out through the homework.
Absolutely.
But it's pervasive in everything that they're doing.
Exactly. It's going to affect school or work or relationships. Absolutely. Yep. So touching on the heels of this kind of point in terms of the impact it had on him professionally, the business side. I mean, he said one meeting in particular was worse than any other. He was bombarded with questions about why he's a bad person or a bad teammate, and he couldn't say anything. He just took it for hours. He says, I was told that I was a bad influence. I had less than one chance, and then I would be buried in the minors, and that would end my career. I was crushed. And he even talks about how that right there made him want to drink.
Yep.
We talked in the Josh Gordon episode about how, teams need to know that, like, endless criticism and labeling and punishment is going to do the opposite of what you're looking for. It's just going to make that person want to use, especially with substance use, want to use more.
Right.
Not going to help them get better. This was this was like him trying to find a new team to sign with, but it just shows that we've tried to be balanced on this. We try to give some examples of how teams or leagues are making some progress and are coming along with their understanding about mental health. But this to me shows the opposite. So I think we don't want to knock the NHL, because I think he actually speaks very positively
highly
of the NHL,
for the
NHLPA, the substance abuse program or track for NHL players.
Yeah.
He also, like you said, that the Sabres GM, he says, is still supportive to him.
Yeah, checks in with him still.
Checks in with him. He's not on that team anymore. Right, so that's great. The Islanders team, which he eventually signed with, was very accepting about his situation and understanding. So that is great. I think but it does still show that, like, we have a ways to go a little bit. There are a lot of teams and a lot of sports executives that have no idea what mental health even means, and they definitely judge it, and they definitely use it as a disclusionary criteria without knowing anything, without an understanding.
Yeah, I think the key thing that I would hope would be, what are they communicating? What are they trying to communicate through their behavior? And like for guys especially, and not just guys, females do this as well. But because we're not allowed to, we don't have the ability to sort of communicate, or we talked about Kevin Love, like, I learned how to communicate when I was 30, stuff like that, or DeMarcus DeRozan. I can't remember who said it.
DeMar DeRozan
said it. Same level of thing. And so we communicate through our behavior. And so one thing that was one of the ones that stuck out to me too was that interview that he talked, or that meeting that he talked about, of just like, you're a terrible person, you're awful, you're never going to do anything. How is that supposed to help him, motivate him to want to do better? And the question they should have been asking is, why are you here? What happened? What's going on?
Yeah.
What are you trying to communicate to us? Show some curiosity to maybe actually show some support and understanding, like you mentioned. And then, okay, well, if we have an understanding of what's going on, then you can make an informed decision of, is this team going to be able to support what you need, rather than just being like, you're a terrible person. Okay, go ahead. Right.
Exactly.
And like you said, it just made him want to drink again.
No, totally. And it kind of reminded me of the Michael Phelps episode where that teacher just told him, like, you're never going to amount to anything, I think, right? Was that him?
Yeah.
Yeah, where it's like, who says that?
I know.
I don't know how these people get into prominent positions, but it's kind of a shame. So on the hockey side, I think we talked about on the business side, the ramifications that this had on Robin Lehner. On the hockey side, I think it's also important to get into that a little bit, because, for him, he came to realize how bipolar disorder affected his play, right? Where he kind of, says that, I had never had a sober season of hockey in my entire career. Yeah. With those manic swings, I could see the pattern. When I was hypomanic and in a good mood, I was a solid goalie. The depressive state, not so much. I can definitely see that, right? Yep. When you're in a manic state, you are keyed up. You have confidence that's off the charts. We know confidence plays a huge role in sports.
Yep.
So you have confidence and you have unlimited energy. I can see how that would make someone really
very effective,
excel in that state.
Sure.
And that's a loss for him because while it was obviously a bad thing for his life to have untreated bipolar disorder, it was helping him in the hockey sense.
Right.
And so we're going to get into this in the next episode about recovery from injury. But this is kind of like a recovery from mental injury. And we're going to talk about that more because, when you have had something that was bad for you, but that helped your playing career taken away, there's an adjustment. You have to relearn, kind of create a new identity on the ice, relearn who you are as a player, and that can sap confidence short term. I think it's why it's important to work with people because it can help build that up quicker.
And why it's so fearful to try.
Yes, absolutely. So he says that after he got clean and addressed his mental illness, he was able to finally love and feel love as a husband and a father, but that the hardest part was getting back to hockey. So I think the key thing on that for me is that like this sort of, I kind of think it touches on the men's playbook point a little bit because he says along the lines of finally being able to love and feel love as a husband and a father, he also said that it finally didn't matter. I was going to rehab for myself and my family. It was the one thing I've done in my life that made me feel like a true man. That to me is like, I think guys often fail to realize that the very emotionally vulnerable thing they're avoiding actually makes you feel like more of a man than any of the BS that you're probably engaging in terms of trying to act or look powerful. Doing the things like being true to yourself, being there for your family members, for your spouse, for your kids. There's nothing more manly than that. And I think the reason why is because it's not about masculinity. It has nothing to do with being a man or masculinity.
No.
It's about being a good person, and it's about being loving to the people that matter to you in your life, and that has nothing to do with gender.
Right.
I think that's an
being
important point.
Available to them. Yeah,
absolutely. So there's a couple other athletes with bipolar. Ben Gordon is one I've heard of. Delonte West. We might focus on one of those athletes at some point for a specific episode on bipolar. We wanted to cover trauma and PTSD first, and especially because like Robin Lehner has bipolar, but it was caused by his trauma. So I think that's another reason why we wanted to focus on the trauma and PTSD today. Before we get to the more mental health spotlight, a couple other takeaways. His efforts to connect and validate people in the community was really awesome. I think, he obviously speaks out, and we've dealt with a lot of athletes that speak out publicly. I think most athletes also do individual kind of stuff, but him especially, he's really made an effort to connect with individual fans. I mean, I think I've read some stories about people who kind of like saw the hashtag same here and like reached out and or somehow found a way to reach out to him, not expecting anything in return, to have him like connect and really get on their level. You can't imagine how impactful that is to a person when an athlete, and this is why we want to shine a light on these athletes because they are really important to a lot of people, and it can make a difference in a lot of people's lives, So same here. We talked about that. That's that hashtag. It's an expression which means, according to him, I've faced challenges in life too. Those challenges have affected my mental health. It's a sign that we hope will unite the world once and for all, normalize how universal the topic of mental health is. And I think he mentions how like the demon on his mask sort of represents, some of the demons that he's dealt with and things like that. So I think on that, any other takeaways for you before we get to the mental health spotlight?
Those are the big ones for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of PTSD, let's see. I want to go through a little bit, I guess we try not to be too jargony, but we want to go through a little bit of some data on PTSD and a little bit of the what goes into that diagnosis, just so people kind of know the basics. I think it's for the data source, we used SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They say that more than 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by age 16, which is pretty staggering. Potential, we've talked in the past about how the definition of trauma has really evolved. It used to be much more specific, usually to returning war vets and things like that, but it's evolved a lot in a good way, so we know more about what can potentially be traumatic. And it includes, potentially traumatic events includes psychological, physical, and sexual abuse, community or school violence, witnessing or experiencing domestic violence, national disasters or terrorism, commercial sexual exploitation, sudden or violent loss of a loved one, refugee or war experiences, military, family-related stressors such as deployment, parental loss, or injury, physical or sexual assault, neglect, serious accidents or life-threatening illness, and then I added bullying as well because I've definitely seen that cause it. as you can see, there's a lot of different things that can cause trauma and therefore have the potential to cause PTSD. Not every traumatic incident leads to PTSD, but it always has the potential to lead to that. Usually if a person is experiencing post-traumatic symptoms, which we'll get to, for over a month after, that's when you really start to get worried about PTSD, or you can meet that diagnosis. So 1 in 4 high school students was in at least one physical fight. 1 in 5 high school students was bullied at school. 1 in 6 experienced cyberbullying. 19% of injured and 12% of physically ill youth have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is pretty high. And more than half of U.S. families have been affected by some type of disaster at 54%. So as you can see, like trauma is a huge risk for a lot of people, and I think it's still covered up far too often. In terms of the diagnosis, so we kind of, I tried to go through the 5 different areas that we kind of look for in terms of PTSD to see if a person's actually struggling with that. The first is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So that can be direct, it can be witnessed, it can be vicarious, which means like you're living it through someone you know, or it can be repeated or extreme exposure to traumatic details. So think like an EMT, someone who is exposed to a lot of blood or a lot of gore, things like that, repetitively showing up to those scenes. That can do it for sure. Second one is intrusive symptoms associated with the trauma. So think like memories, dreams, flashbacks. That you can't control. That means they're sort of intruding into your active thought during the day. Third one is avoidance of traumatic details, so internally or externally. So we're trying to avoid thinking about it. We're trying to avoid places that remind us of it.
People that remind us of it.
Fourth one is negative changes in thoughts or mood associated with the traumatic event. So, think like can't remember details, blaming yourself, lack of interest in activities, constant negative emotions like fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame, as well as detachment or the inability to experience positive emotions. So that's the fourth one. And the fifth one is noticeable changes in arousal or reactivity. So think someone who's like really irritable, reckless or self-destructive, hypervigilant, so like kind of always on guard, issues with concentration, and sleep issues. So those are the 5 kind of things we tend to look for with PTSD. We're going to get into some suggestions for people who may be struggling with PTSD. Disclaimer about mental health tips. Again, a lot of these things are easy to understand, hard to execute, as we always say, but especially with PTSD, you really need to be working with someone. It is like, as much as we want to provide some helpful information, I would caution people to think that they can hear anything on this podcast and just go self-treat. Right. You really need to be working with a professional with PTSD.
Yep. This is more just to sort of help if you are kind of going through some of these things to understand that, wow, I didn't know that this was something. I can't. The amount of times I hear people who are just like, well, this was just normal for me for a long time, and not know that it was something that they could have gotten help with, that this wasn't normal, and you could be, something could go differently for you.
Totally.
So hopefully that's it. But like you said, I think especially with PTSD, working with a trained professional is crucial.
Absolutely. And so we, getting connected with a trained professional is probably number one step. Understanding the percentage of those, with addiction who have underlying trauma, very important. We've talked about that in past episodes. If you are dealing with substance abuse issues, there may be a chance that you have some trauma in your background, and we went over the different types of trauma. If any of those apply, think that might be a cause. There's something that fuels it. We talked about how the definition of trauma has changed over the years, so there's a lot of different examples of what might be traumatic to somebody, and it's not. Contrary to a lot of popular belief, it's not weakness if you are affected by trauma. It is like luck of the draw, that you could send like 10 soldiers into the same battle and 1 or 2 are going to come out with it. It's not because they're weak. It's at random. We don't even know. No. As far as I know, in terms of the research scientifically, who is more susceptible to that and who isn't. So I got a few suggestions for people, to start with. I would say, as hard as it often is, to resist this urge, try not to blame yourself. I think that's the number one thing we see is people blame themselves for the trauma that they went through. Try not to isolate and try not to numb, right? So you got to get connected to a therapist, get connected to people in your life. Don't isolate. Don't numb with substance abuse and self-harm. Get help and support instead. We have a couple helpful numbers. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 1-800-273-TALK. The National Helpline for Substance Abuse is 1-800-662-HELP. And there's a crisis text line where you can text the word CONNECT, CONNECT, to 741-741. as well as if you're trying to find a therapist. I mean, we like Zen Care.
Yeah.
It's a startup, or was a startup. I don't know how, nationally widespread they are, but I prefer that website for finding a good therapist.
Me too.
Psychology Today is kind of a backup.
Yeah.
So in terms of getting into PTSD or trauma, any suggestions, John, in terms of the people listening, what you think they might be able to do?
No, I think you bring up a good point. I think with most people with PTSD, there's some form of shame, some form of blaming for themselves. And I think, so part of treatment is going to be to sort of address that and reconstruct that narrative that they've been feeding themselves forever. And addressing sort of, we've talked about harm reduction in past episodes, but making sure that they're, the way in which they've been either managing it or are thinking that they should manage it is healthy. I think the other thing too that tends to happen with PTSD is isolation. So really wanting to help them stay connected. If there's some sort of a support group that they can go talk to around a similar type of traumatic event, normalization of other people who have gone through that and having a sort of a support group for that specifically. I think that can be really effective too. And there's plenty of them out there. We'll put some, you just listed off a bunch of really great resources. We'll put some more in there as well in the show notes as well. But connection, I think, when you get stuck in your own head, reliving this experience over and over and over again, it's hard to establish relationships with people without that interfering. So getting people connected, I think, is really huge, and keeping them connected to their support networks. I think, and also too, some small doses of addressing what happened. I think if you try to go too fast, too furious, I guess, you are likely to sort of re-traumatize.
Absolutely.
Or go, it's not going to be helpful. And I think there's plenty of treatment ways to address some of this stuff. There's mindfulness. There's, something called EMDR, which is sort of a way to sort of address something quickly and then refocus onto something different, and breathing through a distraction and come back to it. I think small doses is really key. It's a process. It's not a light switch. And I think patience is another thing too with mental illness and mental health, just in general, patience is key. But with PTSD, I think especially it's something that's been obviously traumatic and pervasive, and it takes time for some of these things to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned, not going too fast, too quickly, right?
Yeah.
Too much, too fast. I think that's really key because, I'm not sure about your approach, John. I tend to use more of a narrative-based therapy for trauma.
Yep.
We're not trained in EMDR, but we're going to talk about that a little bit because those are the two ones that I see the most is more like, narrative-based and then EMDR. But it is really key that people don't get into it too quick, because with a narrative-based therapy, you're going to do a trauma narrative at some point in the treatment, which means you're going to discuss in vivid detail in terms of all the sensory information that was going on, what you went through.
Yep.
You can't get into that quickly. That you have to, the first step is what's called seeking safety. So, right. Yeah. So the first step with people, and this includes if a client comes in, we have to be very careful that they don't, if we ask them about their background, they don't immediately get into what's called a trauma narrative, because that can happen.
Yep.
And I would encourage, if people have been through trauma, to be cautious about repeating the story to people before you've gotten support and treatment, because it can re-traumatize you very easily.
Right.
Until you've been able to really get yourself in a safe place. So creating a safety plan is usually the first step of most therapeutic approaches for trauma, but it definitely is for narrative-based therapy. So you create a safety plan. You need to be doing this with someone ideally, but we can go through what's typically on a safety plan. Typically, it's a way of planning ahead so you can cope with PTSD symptoms as they come, so they don't catch you off guard. You identify and understand your triggers. That's the first step. So understanding the people, places, things, thoughts that tend to can re-trigger or re-traumatize you. You have to understand what those are. That could also be like anniversaries, certain shows, holidays, smells, anything like that, right? Could really,
anything sensory,
absolutely. Write down a list of emergency contacts. So family, friends, a therapist, right? Asking them for help, especially before you may be at risk, before you're going somewhere that may re-trigger you or that kind of thing. Really key that you're proactive. We talk about being proactive a lot with mental health. That's definitely key. So those are the first two, understanding your triggers, and then write down in your list of emergency contacts. Making sure your meds are on you. If you're on medication, making sure you have access to those is really key. Identifying healthy ways of coping. Typically, we do kind of deep breathing and grounding exercises. Those tend to be the most helpful. And then identifying early warning signs. So changes in thoughts, mood, behavior, stuff like that might kind of clue you in, like, I feel like I'm shifting in the wrong direction. I may be getting re-traumatized. That's really important. Last one on a safety plan is trying to identify what helps you feel safe and in control, whether those are people, places, activities, stuff that's going to make you feel more in control, more empowered, less the opposite. Those are really key. So that's really all we want to get into for now, I think, is just try to make sure safety is your first priority and getting connected to care. After that, in narrative-based therapy, then you get into remembrance and mourning. So you're kind of grieving the traumatic incident. And then reconnection is the last step. So you're usually taking concrete steps to integrate the lessons from the traumatic experience into your life moving forward, which increases power and control over your future, right? So those are kind of the 3 steps, where it's safety, then remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. So this is where, like, in session, you would, again, we're not trained in this. No. It's basically where a therapist, that you kind of recite in detail your trauma, and a therapist is kind of telling you where and how to shift your eyes. And something about the focus on where your eyes are going sort of unlocks the part of your brain that may be re-traumatized by the telling of your story, and allows you to sort of relearn how to understand that story without being as traumatized. So we're not licensed in that, but basically you kind of relive the traumatic experiences in brief doses while the therapist directs your eye movements. Over time, that reduces the impact the memories have on you. It's particularly helpful for those who struggle to talk about their past experience. So that's definitely, I would encourage anyone to look into that. An EMDR licensed clinician, if they're looking for help with that. So any other things for the mental health spotlight, John, you think we should cover?
Yeah, no, that was good.
Okay. We usually give an example of Grim Drive. Today, for me, I just want to call some attention to mental health clinicians in general, particularly in hospitals, but really everywhere, trying to support so many others while also balancing their own mental health. That's not an easy thing to do. And I think usually therapists or mental health clinicians are pretty good about understanding the importance of self-care, but everyone's got their limits. So I think it takes a lot of grim drive and a lot of dedication to be able to do that job and keep helping people.
Yeah, I agree.
Quick call to action, just a reminder to click subscribe on your podcast listening platform. Whether that's, click subscribe on Apple or even on YouTube. You can also click follow on Spotify. And then rate and review the podcast if possible. You can't really do that on Spotify, but you can definitely do that on Apple. We appreciate all the feedback. We're offering a pair of free Celtics tickets or any sporting event to a game in 2021 to 2022. For anyone who writes an honest review for us in the first 3 months of 2021, you can enter to win these tickets by taking a screenshot of your review and submitting that through the Contact Us option on our website at grimdrive.com. It's going to ask you for your name and email address and provide you with the option to upload the screenshot. Make sure you take the screenshot of the review before you click submit. That way you have it saved in your phone and you can upload that. All of the helpful information and links that we've described today can be accessed in the show notes and on our website at grimdrive.com. Really appreciate everyone listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about Robin Lehner and PTSD. We'll be back next week to talk about Dak Prescott and recovery.
Thanks, everybody.